I decided to put the tunnel aside and focus on something else for a while. I'd never really been happy with the swing's driving mechanism. It was clunky, it was prone to errors, it didn't quite swing far enough, and I didn't like the pause between direction changes. I thought some kind of linkage would give a smoother action, but I know absolutely nothing about linkages. I needed to convert a 360-degree rotation into a 180-degree oscillation. I'm sure there's some kind of mathematical formula for calculating the required lengths of beams, but I didn't pay enough attention in school, so I'd have to use a trial and error approach. I started with a simple 3-bar linkage, which I already knew wouldn't work. The final lift arm in the chain needed to oscillate 180 degrees, which could only be done by pushing one end through a 180-degree arc. This couldn't actually be done by 3 bars, as one of them would need to physically change length during the movement. I'd need to introduce a 4th bar to achieve this, and if I couldn't even get the hang of 3 bars, I had no hope with 4. I considered whether I could use a linkage to move a gear rack, but then I'd have to find the correct sized gear for the rack to rotate 180 degrees, and that's a whole load more maths I don't know. If I could create a 90-degree oscillation, I could potentially double the output rotation with gears. I played around until I found something that looked fairly close, then installed the gears to double it. That looks pretty close. Unfortunately, testing it upside down revealed that gravity may have been playing a part, as it was now several degrees short. The timing of the movement also appeared uneven. I tried searching YouTube for any useful information and came across a channel dedicated entirely to 3D renders of mechanical contraptions. They had several videos of both 90 and 180 degree oscillating linkages, but it seemed I'd need lengths of lift arms that simply didn't exist. How do you divide Lego by the square root of 2? But then I came across a simpler system using a rack and pinion, and crucially one which is evenly timed throughout the movement. The output angle travelled is actually dictated by the size of the gear and the length of the rotating arm, so it took a few attempts to find the right combination. I found that using fixed points on the rotating lift arm was giving me just under or just over 180 degrees output, so I swapped it out for connectors with an axle at the end, then I could precisely set the effective length of the arm. Something which had been bugging me about my swing was the ever so slight tilt of the platform, and I knew exactly what was causing it. All of Lego's gears have a tooth at 12, 3, 6 and 9 o'clock, so when the gear running over the turntable was at 12 o'clock, the tooth at the top of the turntable prevented the gear from sitting straight, causing the slant in the platform. The only way to overcome this was to rotate the turntable by 45 degrees to give me a gap between the teeth at 12 o'clock, but working with 45 degree angles in Lego is not easy. Lego doesn't make any 45 degree Technic connectors, and their closest created some very awkward spacings to have to work with. I tested placing a lift arm across the centre of the turntable and rotating it to see whether any of the pinholes might align with surrounding framework. Some holes appeared very close, but I didn't want to place any stress on parts. Turning to the Technic Bible, I found one glimmer of hope from a page with a simple triangular truss. If attaching a turntable to this would give the result I wanted, then I'd have a starting point, but it wasn't as simple as just attaching it, then connecting it to the other framework. Doing this would mean the central point of the turntable and the pivot of the swing were misaligned with the support frame, making it difficult to connect a drivetrain. To correct this, I'd need to position the swing's frame at fractional unit distances, which I could do by kind of floating the frame on 2 pairs of axles. 2 horizontal axles connected to the swing's frame were connected to 2 vertical axles connected to the supporting frame. Doing this allowed precise positioning anywhere within the lengths of the 4 axles. Throughout the process of installing the swing, I got a little tired of cramming my fingers in tight holes, and decided to redesign the support frame with larger frame pieces. I'd initially installed the driving arm for the rack through one of the frames, and offset the arms it would push at the end of the rack, but I found that this would pull the edge of the rack downward, causing the guide rail to bind. I was planning to install the platform below the rack, but I didn't think this would be enough as the other end could still lift. To move the lift arms to the centre of the rack, I'd need to use offset connectors, but this resulted in the arms hanging away from the rack, creating an imbalance. To counter this, I could bring the connectors under the rack, but then I couldn't rest it on a platform. I realised that I could extend the connectors to create a 1-unit gap, but I still found that the rack would lift and bind. My first test model had worked much smoother with the 2 arms centred both horizontally and vertically, so I went back to this design, but I didn't feel the guide rail was going to work out due to being prone to binding. Instead, I decided to set the rack in a frame that would only allow the movement I wanted. As I was building up the model, I did a quick test of the swing and noticed it was still coming up higher on one side than the other. Everything appeared to be centered, the arm was driving the rack equally in both directions, so what could be the reason behind this? Once again, LEGO's gear design was at fault. The gear rack I was using had a tooth in its central position, meaning the gear was always rotated just left or right of centre, creating that little extra lift when the swing was extended out. Looking at the different racks I had, I found there were a couple that had a gap at the central position, though I didn't have one long enough available at the time. I did check rack plates too, but they lay awkwardly between the two types. I redesigned the rack in Studio, along with the drivetrain for the columns, but as I started building again, there was a minor catastrophe. As I spilled not one, but two of my Technic tubs across the floor. After a fun half hour picking up and separating parts, I carried on installing the columns, but found the first gear ratio I tested moved them just beyond what I needed. I put my gear ratio into a calculator, then worked out a new ratio just a little smaller, but it looked like it was just enough to give me the range I wanted. My build was still in two halves at this point, so I needed to connect the framework together and to couple the drivetrains. I really hadn't left myself much room to work with, and there was a very obvious difference in build style between the two parts, making it difficult to find suitable connection points. I very briefly looked at redesigning the framework of the first half, before quickly deciding it was too big a job that I couldn't be bothered with. The drivetrains were kind of awkward to link, as there was a half unit's difference in height between the frames. I could have driven them independently, as they didn't need to be synchronized, but I have a fairly limited number of motors available. Testing it out, everything appeared to work mechanically. The columns needed a cover to keep them pressed against the gears, and the rolling sonic was still unreliable, but those weren't mechanical issues. I spent some time designing the facade, rather than facing the tunnel issue again. I had left a gap behind a low platform, but I felt it looked kind of odd now, so I brought the wall in against it. While adding a floating platform to the wall, I realised I'd incorrectly matched up the checkered pattern. Watching this video back, I am wondering whether I can correctly match the inner and outer corners of the build. I'd originally wanted to cover over all the mechanical parts of the swing, but eventually had to accept that the chain and gear keeping the platform upright would have to be visible. I was able to cover over the excess lift arm and upper gears, though they would peek out when the swing was elevated, but I now discovered it wouldn't be possible to cover parts of the turntable due to a lack of clearance. I had to physically test exactly where I was able to place multiple panels to ensure there were no collisions. It took a while, but I think I managed to maximise coverage.